Sometimes the pain of losing someone you love can drive you to do the impossible. When a brother's blood cries out for justice, how far would you go to answer that call? Thormund Firevein stood before his clan with an incredible story. He had killed 60 warriors in a single day, all by himself. The Great Hall of Ulfstad fell silent as this giant of a man placed his bloodied hands on the judgment table. His brother was dead, murdered by the Raukr Clan, and Thormund had kept his promise of revenge. But now his own people faced a terrible choice. The men he killed were from a clan that wanted peace. Now they wanted war. Should they cast out their greatest warrior or embrace the weapon they had created? As the fires burned behind him, Thormund spoke just 4 words that would change everything. I warned them once. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 moons before the bloodshed that would shake 2 clans, Thormund Firevein lived a life of quiet strength in the settlement of Ulfstad. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, and he stood at the edge of his family's longhouse, watching his younger brother Ragnar practice sword forms in the courtyard below. At 28 winters, Thormund had earned his place among the clan's most respected warriors, but violence had never been his calling. He preferred the forge to the battlefield, crafting weapons rather than wielding them in anger. Ragnar, barely past his 20th winter, moved with the fluid grace of water finding its course. Where Thormund was mountain-solid and deliberate, Ragnar flowed like quicksilver. Their father often said the gods had split one perfect warrior between 2 sons, giving Thormund the strength and Ragnar the speed. This morning, as every morning for the past year, Ragnar wore their father's silver arm ring, a band of intricately woven metal that caught the pale sunlight like captured moonbeams. "You're holding your shield too low," Thormund called down, his voice carrying the patient tone of an older brother who had given this same advice 1,000 times. "A spear thrust will find your ribs before you can react." Ragnar grinned up at him, sweat glistening on his brow despite the cool air. "And you're standing there like a worried mother hen when you should be helping me prepare for the trading expedition." The expedition. For weeks, it had been the talk of Ulfstad. The clan elders had chosen Ragnar to lead a small party north to the Raukr settlements, carrying fine metalwork and furs to trade for amber and whale oil. It was an honor for one so young, a recognition of his quick wit and natural charm with strangers. But it also meant crossing territories where old grudges ran as deep as the fjords themselves. Thormund descended the wooden steps, his massive frame making each plank groan under his weight. At 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, he cast a shadow that followed him like a loyal hound. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver from years at the forge, was bound back with leather cords. Scars marked his arms and hands, not from battle, but from the honest work of shaping metal and stone. "The Raukr territory is unsettled," Thormund said, watching his brother continue the sword forms. "There have been raids along the coastal settlements. Wolves, both 4-legged and 2-legged, grow bold when winter approaches." Ragnar lowered his practice sword and turned to face his brother fully. The silver arm ring caught the light again, and Thormund felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he thought of their father's legacy resting on his younger brother's arm. Their father, Bjorn Ironhand, had been a legendary warrior who died defending their settlement when Thormund was 16 and Ragnar barely 8. The arm ring had been his most prized possession, forged by the master smiths of the southern kingdoms and inscribed with runes of protection. "The elders chose me because they trust my judgment," Ragnar said, but there was no arrogance in his voice. "And because I can talk my way out of trouble faster than most men can fight their way out." This was true. Ragnar possessed a gift for words that could turn enemies into friends and transform tense negotiations into celebrations. Where other young warriors boasted of their strength or courage, Ragnar understood that the greatest victories often came without drawing a blade. It was this wisdom, combined with his genuine warmth, that had made him beloved throughout Ulfstad. The brothers walked together toward the clan's great hall, where smoke from the morning cooking fires rose like prayers to the gods. Women moved between the buildings carrying baskets of bread and preserved fish, their voices creating a comfortable murmur that spoke of a community at peace with itself. Children chased each other between the buildings, their laughter echoing off the wooden walls and stone foundations. Ulfstad had been their family's home for 5 generations. Their great-great-grandfather had chosen this spot where the fjord curved inland, protected from the worst winter storms, but open to trading ships from both north and south. The settlement had grown slowly but steadily, earning a reputation for honest dealing and fine craftsmanship. Their metalwork was prized throughout the northern territories, and their warriors were respected for their skill and honor. "I've been thinking about what you said," Ragnar began as they approached the hall's carved doors. "About starting my own family, settling down," Thormund raised an eyebrow. His brother had always been more interested in adventure than domestic life, much to their mother's gentle frustration. "And there's a girl in the Westvik settlement, Astrid, daughter of the shipbuilder Olsen. I met her during the midsummer gathering." Ragnar's cheeks colored slightly, and Thormund had to suppress a smile. For all his confidence in most matters, his brother became awkward as a young boy when talk turned to women. "Is she the reason you're so eager for this trading mission?" Thormund asked. "The route passes near Westvik." "Perhaps," Ragnar's grin returned. "She has eyes like summer sky and a laugh that could charm the fish from the sea. But she's also clever. She knows numbers better than most merchants and can spot a dishonest trader from across a market square." They entered the great hall, where the clan elders were gathered around the central fire pit. Harald Greybeard, the clan leader, looked up from the carved wooden map he was studying. At 63 winters, Harald had led Ulfstad for nearly 20 years, guiding them through good seasons and bad with steady wisdom. His beard, once golden like wheat, now flowed white as fresh snow down to his chest. "Thormund, good," Harald said, gesturing them closer. "I wanted you both to see the route one final time before Ragnar departs." The map was a masterwork of carved oak, showing the coastline, fjords and settlements for hundreds of miles in each direction. Small carved stones marked friendly territories in white, neutral areas in grey, and hostile regions in black. The proposed route to Raukr lands wound north along the coast, passing through several neutral territories before entering what had traditionally been peaceful trading grounds. "The journey should take 8 days if the weather holds," explained Olaf the navigator, a weathered man whose knowledge of currents and winds was legendary. 3 days to reach the Raukr settlements, 2 days for trading, and 3 days return. The autumn storms haven't begun yet, but they could start any time after the new moon. Thormund studied the route, noting how it passed through the territory of several smaller clans. "What word from the border settlements? Any unusual activity?" "Nothing definite," Harald admitted, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Some reports of increased raiding, but that's normal as winter approaches. Desperate men do desperate things when they face cold and hunger. The Raukr clan has always been honorable in their dealings," added Sven the merchant, who had traded with them many times over the years. "Their leader, Grim Ironarm, is a man of his word. His people respect the old agreements about safe passage for traders." Ragnar leaned over the map, tracing the route with his finger. 6 men should be sufficient. We'll take the smaller ship, fast and maneuverable if we need to avoid trouble. Light cargo means we can outrun anything larger. Take Bjorn the Younger, Thormund suggested, naming one of their most reliable warriors. And Eric Swiftaxe. Both have steady nerves and good judgment. As the brothers and elders continued planning, Thormund felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Since their father's death, he had become Ragnar's unofficial protector, though his brother had long since proven capable of taking care of himself. The feeling wasn't rational. Ragnar was a skilled warrior and navigator in his own right, but love rarely listened to logic. Later that afternoon, as the autumn sun painted the fjord in shades of gold and amber, the brothers sat together on the rocky shore where they had played as children. Ragnar was checking his gear one final time, ensuring his sword was sharp and his traveling clothes were in good repair. The silver arm ring gleamed on his wrist as he worked. "Father wore that ring on his last voyage," Thormund said quietly. Ragnar paused in his preparations and looked down at the silver band. He also came home safely from that voyage. He wore it for 15 years of trading expeditions and raids, and it never failed to bring him back to us. He wasn't wearing it when he died defending the settlement. "No," Ragnar agreed softly. "He gave it to Mother the night before the attack, told her to keep it safe for his sons. She gave it to me when I came of age, but I've always known it belonged to both of us." Thormund reached over and clasped his brother's shoulder. "Keep it. Father would want you to have it, and it suits you better than it would me. Besides, you're the one going into unknown territory." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fishing boats return with the day's catch. Seagulls cried overhead, and the familiar sounds of the settlement continued behind them. The ring of hammer on metal from the forge, the lowing of cattle being brought in for the evening, the distant sound of children being called to their suppers. "Promise me something," Thormund said as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "Anything, if trouble finds you. Real trouble, not just the usual trading disputes. Don't try to be a hero. Take your profit or your loss and come home. No trade goods are worth your life." Ragnar was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried an unusual weight. "I promise to come home, brother. Whatever happens, I'll find my way back to Ulfstad." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a steady wind from the south that would fill the ship's sail and speed their journey north. The entire settlement turned out to see the trading party off, as was traditional for any significant voyage. The ship, called Wind's Daughter, sat low in the water with her cargo of metalwork, furs, and amber beads carefully secured in waterproof bundles. Ragnar embraced their mother, Ingrid, who pressed a small cloth bundle into his hands, travel bread baked with honey and herbs that would keep fresh for weeks. She was a strong woman who had raised 2 sons largely alone after their father's death. But Thormund could see the worry lines around her eyes as she watched her younger boy prepare to leave. "The gods watch over those who honor their family and clan," she whispered as she held Ragnar close. "Remember who you are and where you come from." "I will, mother," Ragnar promised. Tucking the bread bundle into his traveling pack, Harold Greybeard stepped forward with the formal blessing that marked the beginning of any important journey. "May Thor's hammer clear your path, may Odin's ravens bring you wisdom, and may the winds of Njord speed your return to those who love you." The crew of 6 men boarded the ship with practiced efficiency. Besides Ragnar, there was Bjorn the Younger, Eric Swiftaxe, Gunnar the Scout, Magnus Lightfoot, and old Thorstein, whose knowledge of Raukr customs and language made him invaluable for trading negotiations. They were good men all, tested in both peace and conflict, as Wind's Daughter pulled away from the dock, her sail billowing with the steady southern breeze. Thormund stood at the water's edge, watching until the ship disappeared around the bend of the fjord. The silver arm ring caught the morning sunlight one last time before vanishing from sight, and Thormund felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He could not have known that he would never see his brother alive again, or that the next time he saw that silver arm ring, it would be stained with blood and clutched in the hands of a dying messenger. He could not have foreseen that his quiet life of forging metal and keeping peace would soon transform into something the skalds would sing about for generations. All he knew, standing alone on the shore as the morning mist began to rise from the water, was that his heart felt heavy with an unnamed dread, and that he would count every day until Ragnar's safe return home to Ulfstad. 11 days had passed since Wind's Daughter disappeared around the fjord's bend, and Thormund found himself walking to the shore each evening as the sun set behind the western mountains. Ragnar should have returned by now. 8 days for the journey, maybe 9 if the weather had turned or the trading had gone particularly well. But 11 days was too long, and the knot in Thormund's stomach had grown tighter with each passing hour. The first sign of trouble came not from the sea, but from the forest path that wound down from the northern hills. Thormund was working late at his forge, shaping iron into a blade that would serve one of the settlement's younger warriors, when the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the wooden buildings. Night had fallen hours ago, and honest travelers did not push their horses through mountain trails in darkness unless driven by desperate need. The rider who stumbled into the torchlight of Ulfstad's main square was barely recognizable as human. Blood matted his hair, his clothes were torn and filthy, and his horse was lathered with sweat and foam. But Thormund knew him, Leif Swiftfoot, a young warrior from the Westvik settlement, where Ragnar had spoken of meeting the shipbuilder's daughter. "Help!" Leif gasped, as he slid from his horse's back and collapsed to his knees. "Attack Ragnar's party! They're all dead!" The words hit Thormund like a physical blow. He dropped the hammer he was holding, and it rang against the stone floor of his forge like a funeral bell. Around the square, other members of the settlement emerged from their homes. Drawn by the commotion and Leif's anguished cries, Harold Greybeard appeared quickly, his long white beard hastily braided and his weathered face grave with concern. "Bring him to the hall," the clan leader commanded, "and someone fetch the healer. This man is half dead from exhaustion and loss of blood." They carried Leif into the great hall, where the central fire still burned low from the evening meal. Thormund's mother, Ingrid, arrived with clean water and healing supplies, her movements quick and efficient, despite the tremor in her hands. She had tended wounds before, all the women of Ulfstad had. Learned such skills during the years of border raids and clan conflicts, as Ingrid cleaned the blood from Leif's face, and Harold offered him small sips of strong mead. The young warrior's story emerged in broken fragments. He had been traveling the coastal road toward the Raukr territories, carrying messages between settlements, when he had come upon a scene of slaughter that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. It was by the stone beach where traders often make camp, Leif whispered, his voice raw from exhaustion and grief. "I saw the ship first, Wind's daughter, beached and broken. Her mast was snapped, her sail torn. And then I saw the bodies." Thormund felt the world tilt around him, as if the very foundations of the earth had shifted. His hands gripped the edge of the wooden table so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and he forced himself to breathe steadily while Leif continued his terrible tale. 6 men lay dead around a cold fire pit. I recognized Bjorn the Younger and Eric Swiftaxe. Dorstein the old trader was there too, and the others from the crew. They had fought hard. There were many tracks in the sand, signs of a fierce battle, but they were outnumbered, maybe 3-1. And Ragnar. Thormund's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Leif reached into his torn shirt and withdrew something that made Ingrid cry out in anguish, and Thormund's vision blur with sudden rage. It was their father's silver arm ring. But now it was darkened with dried blood and wrapped around a piece of torn cloth, a fragment of Ragnar's blue traveling cloak. "I found him apart from the others," Leif continued, tears now streaming down his bruised face. They had tortured him before they killed him. Cut him, burned him, made him suffer. There were Raukr weapons scattered around the camp, axes and spears with their clan markings. This was no random raid. This was deliberate murder. The hall fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and Ingrid's quiet weeping. Thormund stared at the blood-stained arm ring in his trembling hands, remembering how it had gleamed in the morning sunlight as Ragnar sailed away. The silver was still beautiful, still intricately woven with their father's protective runes. But now it felt heavy as a mountain, weighted with grief and the promise of vengeance. "There's more," Leif said, his voice dropping to barely audible levels. "I found tracks leading away from the camp. Many men heading north toward Raukr territory. And I found this." He pulled out a carved wooden token, marked with the personal symbol of Grim Ironarm, the Raukr Clan leader. It was left deliberately placed on Ragnar's chest like a message. Harold took the token and examined it carefully, his experienced eyes noting the fresh carving and intentional placement. "This is either a declaration of responsibility, or someone wants us to think the Raukr Clan is responsible." "Does it matter?" Thormund asked, his voice now carrying an edge that made several clan members step back unconsciously. My brother is dead, tortured and murdered by men who should have honored the trading agreements. Whether it was Grim Ironarm himself or his warriors acting without orders, the Raukr clan bears responsibility. We must consider this carefully, Harold counseled. Though his own voice was heavy with anger, Ragnar was beloved by our people, and his death demands justice. But we cannot act in haste. Justice! Thormund stood abruptly, his massive frame seeming to fill the hall despite its high rafters. They tortured him, Harold. They made him suffer before they killed him. What justice can match that crime? Ingrid looked up from where she knelt beside Leif, her face pale, but her voice steady. Your brother was a man of peace, Thormund. He believed in words before weapons, in healing rather than harming. Would he want his death to start a war between our clans? The question hung in the air like smoke from the central fire, and Thormund felt the eyes of his entire community upon him. These people had known him since childhood, had watched him grow from a grieving boy into a man of quiet strength and careful judgment. They trusted him to be measured in his responses, to think before acting, but as he looked down at the blood-stained silver ring in his hands, all thoughts of measure and caution burned away like morning mist before the sun. Ragnar had been more than a brother. He had been the best part of Thormund's world, the light that balanced his own darker nature, the hope for their family's future. And now that light was extinguished forever, snuffed out by men who had violated every code of honor and hospitality that bound their world together. Leif, Thormund said quietly, his voice now calm, but carrying an undertone that made the young warrior straighten despite his exhaustion. How many men left tracks heading north from the camp? At least 20, maybe 25. They weren't trying to hide their trail. They wanted to be followed. And how long ago did this happen? 3 days, maybe 4. The bodies were... Leif swallowed hard. They had been there for some time. Thormund nodded slowly, his mind already calculating distances and travel times. The killers had a significant head start, but they would be moving at the pace of a large group, probably laden with whatever goods they had taken from Wind's daughter. A single man, traveling light and fast, could make up much of that distance. Thormund, Harold said, recognizing the dangerous calm that had settled over the younger man. What are you thinking? Thormund slipped his father's silver arm ring onto his own wrist, where it fit snugly despite the bloodstains. The metal felt warm against his skin, as if it carried some echo of both his father's strength and his brother's spirit. I'm thinking that 25 men killed my brother, he said quietly. And I'm thinking that 25 men aren't nearly enough to stop me from collecting the debt they owe. Before anyone could respond, Thormund strode from the hall and into the cold night air. Behind him, he could hear Harold calling his name, and his mother's voice raised in concern, but their words seemed to come from very far away. All he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, steady and strong, and all he could see was the image of Ragnar's blood-stained cloak wrapped around their father's arm ring. In his mind, he was already planning the hunt that would either bring him justice or join him with his brother in whatever realm awaited them beyond death. Either outcome seemed acceptable, as long as those who had murdered Ragnar paid the full price for their crime. The silver arm ring gleamed in the moonlight as Thormund walked toward his forge, where he would spend the night preparing for a journey that would transform him from protector into something far more dangerous. By dawn, the gentle giant who had shaped metal and kept peace would begin his transformation into the weapon of vengeance that would shake 2 clans and enter legend as the man who killed 60 warriors in a single day of reckoning. The forge burned through the night, its orange glow casting dancing shadows across the stone walls as Thormund worked with methodical precision. His hands, which had crafted countless tools and weapons for his clan, now shaped instruments of personal vengeance. The familiar rhythm of hammer against steel was different now, harder, more purposeful, each strike echoing with the weight of his grief and fury. By morning light, 3 weapons lay cooling on his workbench: a war axe with a blade sharp enough to split hairs, a long knife designed for close work, and a smaller throwing axe balanced for deadly accuracy. Each piece was forged with the skill of a master craftsman, but tempered with something darker than mere expertise. These were not tools for defense or hunting. They were instruments of calculated death. As the sun rose over Ulfstad, Thormund prepared himself for the transformation that had begun the moment he saw his brother's blood-stained cloak. In a wooden chest beneath his sleeping furs, he found what he sought. A small clay jar sealed with wax, its contents unchanged after years of storage. Inside was a mixture of charcoal, animal fat, and sacred herbs. The war paint his grandfather had taught him to make in the old tradition. The ancient war paint jar had belonged to his family for 3 generations, passed down from warriors who had fought in the great battles of their grandfather's time. The recipe was older still, dating back to the berserkers who had served the legendary kings of the north. Applied before battle, it was said to help a warrior find the fury that lived in every man's heart, to unlock the beast that civilization kept carefully caged. Thormund had never used it. His battles had been defensive, fought to protect his settlement and clan from raiders and wild animals. He had always relied on skill and strength, never needing to reach for the darker gifts that ran in his bloodline. But as he opened the jar and smelled the earthy, metallic scent of the paint, he felt something stirring deep in his chest, a cold fire that had nothing to do with the forge's warmth. He applied the paint carefully, using the polished bronze mirror that had been his mother's wedding gift. Black lines traced across his forehead and cheeks, following patterns that were older than memory. Round his eyes, he drew the marks that would make him appear inhuman in battle, a creature of shadow and death rather than flesh and blood. The transformation was not just physical. With each mark, he felt himself becoming something other than the man who had laughed with his brother just days before. When he emerged from his house, the early morning workers stopped their tasks to stare. The gentle giant they had known all their lives was gone, replaced by something that made their hearts race with instinctive fear. The war paint changed not just his appearance, but his very presence, as if he had donned the spirit of his ancestors along with their ancient markings. Harold Greybeard was waiting for him near the Great Hall, the clan leader's weathered face grave with concern. "Thormund, we need to speak before you do something that cannot be undone." "There is nothing to speak about," Thormund replied, his voice carrying a new quality that made the older man step back unconsciously. "My brother was murdered. The debt must be paid. The clan council has met through the night," Harold said carefully. "We will send envoys to the Raukr settlements, demand an explanation and compensation for Ragnar's death. If they refuse justice, we will consider our options. Your envoys will find empty words and false promises," Thormund interrupted. "How long will you talk, while those who tortured my brother sleep peacefully in their beds? How many more innocent traders will die while you pursue diplomacy with murderers?" Several other clan members had gathered now, drawn by the confrontation between their leader and their most respected warrior. Among them was Bjorn Ironside, a veteran fighter who had served with Thormund in border skirmishes, and young Eric the Bold, who looked up to Thormund as a mentor and older brother. "Let me come with you," Eric said suddenly, his hand moving to his sword hilt. "Whatever you're planning, you don't have to face it alone." Thormund turned his painted face toward the young warrior, and Eric took an involuntary step backward. The eyes that looked out from the black markings were no longer entirely human. They burned with a cold fire that spoke of places civilized men were not meant to go. "This is not your burden to carry," Thormund said, but his voice was not unkind. "My brother's death belongs to me alone. I will not ask others to pay the price for my vengeance." "But 25 men, Thormund," Bjorn protested. "Even you cannot face such odds and survive. Let us gather a war party." "A war party moves slowly and leaves a trail that can be followed and countered," Thormund replied. "One man can go where an army cannot, strike where they do not expect, disappear before they can respond. I will hunt them as a wolf hunts sheep, alone, silent, and without mercy." He walked toward the stables where his horse waited. The animal, a sturdy gelding named Ironhoof, shied nervously at his approach. The war paint carried scents that spoke to the deepest instincts of both man and beast, triggering responses that had kept their ancestors alive in a world of predators and prey. As Thormund loaded his supplies, weapons, food for several days, and a water skin, his mother appeared at his side. Ingrid's face was pale but determined, and she carried a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. "If you must do this thing," she said quietly, "then take these with you." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal several items: dried meat that would not spoil, healing herbs for wounds, and a small bone carving of Thor's hammer that had belonged to his father. "And remember that vengeance should not consume the man seeking it. Your brother would not want you to lose yourself in this darkness." Thormund took the bundle and secured it in his saddlebags, then reached out to touch his mother's cheek with surprising gentleness. Despite the war paint and the cold fire in his eyes, her son was still there, buried beneath the warrior he was becoming. "I will come back," he promised. "But I cannot promise that the man who returns will be the same one who leaves." As he mounted Ironhoof and prepared to ride north toward Raukr territory, Harold made one final attempt to reach the man he had watched grow from boy to warrior. "Think carefully about what you're about to do, Thormund. Once you start down this path, there may be no way back. The peace we've built, the relationships between clans, peace." Thormund's laugh was like the sound of ice cracking on a frozen lake. "They tortured my brother, Harold. They made him suffer before they killed him. What peace can exist with such animals?" He wheeled his horse toward the northern path, then paused to look back at the settlement that had been his entire world. The wooden buildings, the smoke rising from morning cooking fires, the people he had protected and served all his adult life, it all seemed smaller now, more fragile, as if he was seeing it through the eyes of something larger and more dangerous than a simple clan warrior. "When I return," he called back to Harold and the others, "we will speak of a different kind of peace. The peace that comes when evil men fear to raise their hands against the innocent." With that, he spurred Ironhoof into a gallop and disappeared into the morning mist that rose from the fjord. Behind him, the people of Ulfstad watched until he was gone, many of them wondering if they would ever see their gentle giant again, or if the painted warrior who rode north would be all that returned from the blood-soaked reckoning that awaited in Raukr territory. The trail north from Ulfstad wound, through dense pine forests and across windswept moorlands, following ancient paths that had been carved by countless generations of traders, raiders, and wanderers. Thormund rode hard for the first day, pushing Ironhoof to cover as much ground as possible while the horse was still fresh. The war paint on his face had dried to a tight mask that reminded him with every expression that he was no longer the man who had embraced his brother farewell. As evening approached, he reached the stone beach where Leif had discovered the massacre. The sight that greeted him was worse than the young warrior's broken words had conveyed. Ravens and crows had been at work, but enough remained to tell the story of what had happened here. The broken mast of Wind's daughter pointed toward the sky like an accusing finger, and dark stains on the sand marked where good men had bled their lives away. Thormund dismounted and walked slowly through the scene, his tracker's eye reading the signs that others had missed. Here, bootprints in the sand showed where Ragnar had been dragged away from his men. There, scorch marks indicated where the killers had built a fire, not for warmth or cooking, but for the heated metal they had used to torture his brother. A child's carved bone whistle lay half buried in the sand, and Thormund recognized it immediately. The bone whistle had been Ragnar's since childhood, carved by their father during a long winter when both boys had been sick with fever. It depicted a running horse with a flowing mane, and Ragnar had kept it as a luck charm, even after he was far too old for such toys. Thormund picked it up with trembling fingers, noting how the bone was stained with blood, but otherwise undamaged. His brother had clutched it even in death, holding tight to memories of happier times as he examined the whistle more closely. Thormund felt something shift inside his chest, not the cold fire of rage that had been building since he heard of Ragnar's death, but something softer and more painful. This small carved bone carried the weight of shared memories, Summer afternoons, when they had pretended to be great warriors. Winter evenings, when their father had told them stories of heroes and gods. Quiet moments between brothers who had never imagined their time together would be cut short. He tucked the whistle carefully into his belt pouch, next to the silver arm ring that had become his talisman of vengeance. 2 artifacts now rode with him, one representing the bond that had been severed, the other carrying the innocence that had been lost. Together, they would guide him through whatever darkness lay ahead. The tracks leading north from the beach were clear enough for even a novice to follow. The Raukr war party had made no effort to conceal their path, confirming what Leif had said about wanting to be followed. They had even left broken branches and scattered belongings to mark their route, as if daring anyone to come after them. Such arrogance spoke of men who believed themselves untouchable. Protected by their numbers and their reputation for savagery, Thormund followed the trail as darkness fell, guided by moonlight and the skills his father had taught him in childhood. The tracks told him much about his quarry. 24 men, not 25 as Leif had estimated, traveling with pack animals and moving at a steady but unhurried pace. They were confident, perhaps overconfident, and they were heading directly toward the main Raukr settlement rather than trying to lose themselves in the wilderness. On the second day, the trail led him into the territory of the Ironwood clan, a small group that maintained neutrality between the larger powers. Their settlement was barely more than a fortified village, but they controlled a crucial mountain pass that made them valuable allies and dangerous enemies. Thormund had traded with them before and knew their customs, so he was careful to approach their borders openly rather than skulking like a raider. The Ironwood scouts found him before he found them, appearing from behind trees and rocks with the silent efficiency of men who had learned to survive in a dangerous world. Their leader, a scarred veteran named Ulf One-Eye, recognized Thormund despite the war paint and raised his hand in greeting. "Thormund Firevein," Ulf said, using the name Thormund had earned for his skill at the forge. "You travel strangely painted and heavily armed for a trading mission." "I follow killers," Thormund replied simply. "Men who murdered my brother and his trading party. Have they passed through your territory?" Ulf's remaining eye hardened, and he spat into the dirt. "Aye, they came through yesterday evening. Raukr warriors, bold as brass and twice as loud. They demanded food and shelter as if they owned our lands, showed no respect for our customs or hospitality. Did they harm any of your people?" "Not directly, but they made threats when my chief questioned their right to passage. Said the Raukr clan was done with the old agreements, done with showing weakness to lesser clans. They spoke of new leadership and new ways of doing business. This was important information. If the Raukr clan was abandoning their traditional alliances and diplomatic protocols, it suggested a broader change in their leadership or philosophy. Perhaps Grim Ironarm was no longer in control, or perhaps he had decided that the time for peaceful coexistence was over. "I need to know their exact numbers and weapons," Thormund said, "and their condition when they pass through." Ulf studied the painted giant before him, noting the cold fire in his eyes and the weapons that hung from his belt and saddle. "You plan to face them alone? That would be foolish, even for a warrior of your reputation." 24 men killed my brother," Thormund replied. 24 men will answer for that crime. No more, no less. Then you'll want to know that they split their party," Ulf said after a moment's consideration. 16 continued toward the main Raukr settlement, but 8 broke off to the east. Those 8 carried the heaviest packs, probably the trade goods they stole from your brother's ship. Thormund felt a grim smile tug at the corners of his mouth beneath the war paint. The killers had divided their forces, thinking themselves safe in their own territory. They had made their first mistake, and it would not be their last. Which group carried my brother's personal effects? "The 8 who went east," Ulf answered. "I saw them handling something that caught the light, looked like silver jewelry. They were arguing about how to divide their spoils. The silver arm ring, or perhaps other items that had belonged to Ragnar and his crew. The thought of these murderers pawing through his brother's belongings, deciding which man would profit from which piece of stolen property, fed the cold fire that burned in Thormund's chest. "The eastern path leads where?" he asked. to an old stone fortress in the hills, maybe 6 hours' ride from here. It's been abandoned for years, but it would make a good place to rest and divide loot. The main trail continues north to the Raukr settlement. Another day's travel for the larger group. Thormund nodded, his decision already made. 8 men would be easier to handle than 24, and if they carried Ragnar's personal effects, they were likely the ones who had been closest to his brother during the torture and murder. Justice demanded that they be the first to pay for their crimes. "My thanks, Ulf One-Eye," Thormund said, preparing to mount Ironhoof. "When this is finished, the Ironwood clan will have the friendship of Ulfstad for as long as I live. And if you don't survive this hunt?" Thormund touched the bone whistle in his pouch, feeling its familiar weight against his fingers. "Then my brother's spirit will know that someone tried to balance the scales. Sometimes that's enough." As he rode east toward the abandoned fortress, following the tracks of 8 men who had no idea that death was following them, Thormund began to plan his first strike in what would become a legend of vengeance that would be told around fires for generations to come. The abandoned fortress crouched against the hillside like a sleeping beast, its stone walls weathered by countless seasons but still standing strong after decades of neglect. Thormund approached it in the pre-dawn darkness, moving on foot through the pine forest that surrounded the ancient stronghold. He had left Ironhoof tethered a mile back, knowing that the final approach would require the silence that only came from careful stalking. The fortress had been built by some forgotten clan in the days when the northern territories were more fractured and warlike. Its walls were thick stone, designed to withstand siege engines and winter storms alike, but time and abandonment had created gaps and weaknesses that a careful observer could exploit. Most importantly, it had only one main entrance, a heavy wooden gate that would funnel any escaping enemies into a predictable path. From his concealed position in the tree line, Thormund studied the structure and counted the men within. 8, as Ulf had said, gathered around a fire in the central courtyard. They had posted no sentries, confident in their numbers and their assumption that no one would follow them into what they considered safe territory. Their arrogance would be their doom. As he watched them divide the stolen goods from Ragnar's trading expedition, Thormund felt the cold fire in his chest grow hotter. One man held up a silver cup that had belonged to Eric Swiftaxe. Another examined a carved ivory comb that old Thorstein had treasured. But it was when the largest of the group, a bearded giant nearly as tall as Thormund himself, pulled out his father's silver armoring that the transformation finally completed itself. Something snapped inside Thormund's mind, like ice breaking under too much weight. The careful, measured man who had spent his life protecting others disappeared entirely, replaced by something that belonged more to legend than reality. He felt his consciousness recede, becoming a passenger in his own body as older. Darker instincts took control. Around his neck hung a necklace he had taken from the alpha wolf of a pack that had threatened Ulfstad 2 winters past. The wolf had been a massive creature, scarred from countless battles and feared by every other predator in the region. Thormund had tracked it for days, through snow and bitter cold, finally facing it in single combat when it had cornered several children from the settlement. The fight had been brutal and primitive, more like a clash between 2 wild animals than a battle between man and beast. When he emerged from the trees, the Raukr warriors looked up from their fire with mild curiosity rather than alarm. In the flickering light, with his war paint partially faded and his weapons sheathed, he might have been any traveler seeking shelter or information. Only when he stepped fully into the courtyard did they begin to understand their mistake. "Who are you, stranger?" called the bearded giant, still holding Ragnar's armring. "This is Raukr territory. State your business or move along." Thormund said nothing. Words belonged to the civilized world, and he had left that world behind when he saw his brother's possessions in the hands of murderers. Instead, he drew his war axe with fluid grace, the firelight running along its edge like liquid gold. The recognition came slowly to the warriors' faces. They had heard descriptions of the painted giant who had been asking questions about their recent raid, but seeing him in person was different from hearing tales around a campfire. This was not a man, this was something older and more dangerous, something that should have remained buried in the songs of their grandfathers. 8 against 1, the bearded warrior said, but his voice carried less confidence than his words suggested. You cannot be serious about facing such odds. Thormund's response was to hurl his throwing axe with deadly accuracy. The smaller weapon took the speaker in the chest, dropping him instantly and sending the silver armring flying from his dead fingers. The remaining 7 men scrambled for their weapons, but Thormund was already moving. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a slaughter, choreographed by instincts older than civilization and guided by skills that transcended normal human capability. Thormund moved like water flowing around rocks, like wind bending through trees, like death given physical form. His war axe sang through the air, finding gaps in armor and weaknesses in defense with supernatural precision. The first man to reach him swung a sword that should have split his skull, but Thormund flowed beneath the blow and opened the warrior's throat with his long knife. The second attacker tried to tackle him, hoping to use weight and numbers to bring him down, but found himself lifted and thrown against the stone wall with enough force to crack ribs and vertebrae. 2 men tried to flank him, while the others pressed a frontal assault, but Thormund seemed to see attacks before they were launched, moving to counter threats that existed only in his enemies' minds. His weapons became extensions of his body, striking with the precision of a master craftsman shaping metal, but infinitely more deadly. The Wolfpack leader's fang necklace bounced against his chest as he fought, a reminder of what he had become. Like the alpha wolf, he was now a creature that existed beyond the normal rules of survival. A predator so perfectly adapted to killing that he seemed supernatural to his prey. Within minutes, 7 men lay dead around the fortress courtyard, and Thormund stood alone among the bodies, his breathing barely elevated despite the intensity of the combat. Blood covered his weapons and clothes, but none of it was his own. The war paint on his face had mixed with enemy blood, creating patterns that would have made him unrecognizable to anyone who had known him before. He retrieved his father's silver arm ring from where it had fallen, cleaning the blood from its surface with careful reverence. As he slipped it back onto his wrist, joining the bone whistle in his collection of sacred artifacts, he felt a moment of clarity pierce through the red haze of violence. 8 men were dead, but 16 still lived. 16 men who had participated in his brother's torture and murder, who were even now probably celebrating their successful raid and planning their next act of savagery. The debt was far from settled, but something had changed in those few minutes of combat. The careful plans and measured approach he had intended to use were no longer necessary. He had discovered something about himself that should have terrified him, should have sent him running back to Ulfstad to beg forgiveness from the gods for what he was becoming. Instead, he felt only a calm certainty that he was finally becoming what he was meant to be. Not a protector or a craftsman, but something far more primal and necessary. A force of nature that existed to balance the scales when civilized justice proved inadequate. As he gathered weapons from the dead men and prepared to continue his hunt, Thormund looked up at the stars that wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns. Somewhere among those distant lights, his brother's spirit was watching, and perhaps finding peace in the knowledge that his death would not go unanswered. 16 men remained. By morning, that number would begin to diminish, and by the time the sun set again, the Raukr clan would learn what happened when they chose to prey upon the innocent. The main Raukr settlement sprawled across a natural harbor where 2 rivers met the sea, its wooden halls and stone foundations speaking of a clan that had grown wealthy through trade and conquest. Thormund approached it in the grey light of dawn, moving like a shadow along the forest edge that bordered the cultivated fields surrounding the town. The remaining 16 warriors had reached their destination during the night. and smoke from their celebration fires still drifted over the settlement's defensive walls. But this was no longer the careful stalking of a hunter pursuing prey. Something fundamental had changed during the slaughter at the fortress, something that went deeper than tactics or strategy. Thormund could feel it in the way his heart beat steadily, despite the approaching battle, in the way his hands remained rock-steady on his weapons, in the way his mind processed the upcoming violence with the same calm precision he had once applied to shaping metal. He was no longer entirely human, and he was beginning to understand that there might be no way back from what he was becoming. From his concealed position, he studied the settlement's defenses and counted the men within. The 16 warriors from the raiding party were there, but they were not alone. At least 40 other fighting men called this place home, plus women, children, and elders who would complicate any direct assault. This was not the abandoned fortress where he could kill in isolation. This was a living community where innocent blood might be spilled alongside the guilty. For a moment, the man he had been reasserted itself, whispering that there had to be another way. Perhaps he could demand single combat with the raid leaders, or challenge them to meet him outside the settlement walls. Perhaps justice could be served without involving an entire clan in the consequences of their warriors' crimes. But then he saw it, hanging from a pole in the settlement's central square like a trophy of conquest, a torn piece of blue cloth that had once been part of Ragnar's traveling cloak. The broken peace treaty scroll lay crumpled beneath it, the formal agreement between clans that his brother had died trying to preserve. They had desecrated both Ragnar's memory and the bonds that held their world together, displaying their contempt for honor and law with deliberate cruelty. The sight of his brother's cloak hanging like a battle standard was the final weight that broke whatever restraints still held the darkness in check. Thormund felt the last of his civilized nature die as cleanly as if someone had cut his throat, leaving behind only the weapon of vengeance that his grief and rage had forged. He emerged from the forest openly, walking toward the settlement's main gate with his war axe in one hand and his long knife in the other. The sentries on the wooden walls saw him coming and called out challenges, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. All Thormund could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat and the whisper of wind through the wolf-fang necklace at his throat. "Who goes there?" shouted the gate captain, a grizzled veteran whose scars spoke of many battles survived. "State your name and business or turn back now." Thormund stopped just outside bow range and lifted his head so that the morning light fell fully on his painted face. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the settlement, reaching every ear within the walls. "I am Thormund, son of Bjorn Ironhand, brother to Ragnar the Peaceful. I come for the men who tortured and murdered my kin. Send them out, and the rest of you may live." A murmur ran through the gathered defenders, and Thormund could see men pointing and talking in urgent whispers. His reputation had preceded him. Word of the slaughter at the fortress had somehow reached them, carried by ravens or wandering scouts, or perhaps just the wind itself. They knew what he was capable of, but they also knew their numbers. "You are outnumbered 50-1, the captain called back, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "Leave now, and we will not pursue you. This is more mercy than you deserve after murdering 8 of our kinsmen." "Your kinsmen were murderers and thieves," Thormund replied, his voice never rising above conversational levels, but somehow audible throughout the settlement. "They tortured an innocent man, violated the laws of hospitality, and broke the peace treaty between our clans. I offer them the same mercy they showed my brother." None at all. He began walking toward the gate again, and this time the sentries did not call for him to stop. There was something in his approach that spoke to the deepest instincts of prey animals, a recognition that running might only delay the inevitable. Several men raised bows, but their arrows seemed reluctant to fly, as if even their weapons understood that this was no ordinary man approaching their walls. The gate opened with a grinding of ancient hinges, and the 16 raiders emerged in full battle gear. They moved with the confidence of veterans who had survived countless fights, but Thormund could see the uncertainty in their eyes as they formed a line across the settlement's main street. Behind them, the rest of the clan's warriors took positions on the walls and rooftops, ready to join the fight if their champions fell. At the center of the group stood a man who could only be Grim Ironarm himself, the Raukr Clan leader whose authority had been invoked by the raiders. He was smaller than Thormund had expected, but his presence radiated the kind of dangerous competence that came from decades of successful leadership. In his hands, he carried a sword that had tasted blood in 100 battles, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had built his power on the bones of his enemies. "So," Grim said, studying the painted giant who faced them, "you are the madman who thinks he can challenge an entire clan. I've heard the stories from the fortress. 8 good men dead because of your grief and rage. But grief makes men do foolish things, and rage burns itself out. You are only one man, no matter how skilled or determined." Thormund said nothing. Words belonged to negotiations and diplomacy, and both had died with his brother on a distant beach. Instead, he raised his war axe in a salute that was older than Christianity, older than the kingdoms of men, as ancient as the first warrior who had ever sought to balance blood with blood. "I warned them once," he said, echoing the words that had begun this tale of vengeance. "Now I warn you, stand aside and let justice be done, or stand with them and share their fate." The broken peace treaty scroll stirred in the morning breeze, a reminder of the diplomatic solution that Ragnar had died trying to preserve. But Thormund was beyond diplomacy now, beyond mercy or compromise. He had become something that existed outside the normal rules of civilization, a force of nature clothed in human flesh and motivated by a love that had transformed itself into perfect, unstoppable hatred. The 16 men before him shifted nervously, weapons ready, but hearts uncertain. They had expected to face a grief-mad brother seeking hopeless revenge. Instead, they found themselves confronting something that belonged more to legend than reality. A creature that their grandfathers might have called the chooser of the slain. Behind them, the torn blue cloth that had once been part of Ragnar's cloak snapped in the wind like a flag of war, marking the moment when words ended and violence began. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Raukr settlement had ever witnessed. Thormund moved through the 16 warriors like a force of nature, his war axe singing through the air with deadly precision, while his long knife found gaps in armor that should not have existed. But this was not the frenzied slaughter of the fortress. This was something more calculated, more deliberate, as if he was reading the very intentions of his enemies before they formed in their minds. Grim Ironarm proved to be a worthy adversary, his swordwork polished by decades of combat, and his tactical mind sharp enough to anticipate some of Thormund's attacks. But even the Raukr clan leader could not match the supernatural fury that drove his opponent, and within minutes he lay bleeding in the settlement's main street, his famous sword broken at his feet. As the last of the 16 raiders fell, Thormund stood alone among the bodies, his breathing barely elevated despite the intensity of the combat. The watching clan members on the walls and rooftops made no move to interfere. They had seen enough to understand that this was beyond their ability to influence. The painted giant had become something that belonged to legend, and legends were not fought with ordinary weapons by ordinary men. But as Thormund knelt beside Grim's dying form, searching for any personal effects that might have belonged to Ragnar, the clan leader's words stopped him cold. You don't understand," Grim gasped, blood frothing at his lips. "Your brother, he was not just a trader." Thormund's hand froze over the scattered belongings around the dead man's body. "What do you mean?" "Secret mission," Grim continued, his voice growing weaker with each word. "Not sanctioned by your clan elders. He came to negotiate something else." From inside Grim's leather jerkin, Thormund pulled out a rolled parchment sealed with wax that bore an unfamiliar mark. As he broke the seal and unrolled the document, his blood turned to ice water in his veins. The writing was in Ragnar's careful hand, But the words it contained rewrote everything Thormund thought he knew about his brother's final mission. The hidden letter from Ragnar revealed a truth that cut deeper than any blade. His brother had not been on a simple trading expedition. He had been conducting secret negotiations to prevent a war that both clans' more aggressive factions were trying to start. Ragnar had discovered that certain members of both the Ulfstad and Raukr clans were working together to manufacture conflicts that would justify raids and conquest, enriching themselves while innocent people paid the price in blood. According to the letter, Ragnar had arranged to meet with moderate leaders from several clans, including Grim Ironarm, to expose this conspiracy and forge new agreements that would preserve the peace their fathers had built. But the war faction had learned of his mission and moved to stop him before he could succeed. The men who killed him, Grim whispered, his eyes growing glassy with approaching death. They were not my warriors, mercenaries, hired by those who profit from conflict. They used Raukr weapons to make you think. The implications hit Thormund like a physical blow. His brother had died, not as a random victim of clan violence, but as a deliberate target of those who wanted to destroy the peace he was trying to preserve. And Thormund's quest for vengeance, his systematic killing of Raukr warriors, was playing directly into their hands, giving them the war they had murdered Ragnar to achieve. As Grim Ironarm breathed his last, Thormund stared down at the letter in his trembling hands. Every word of it rang with the authentic voice of his brother, the careful reasoning and diplomatic language that had made Ragnar so valuable as a negotiator. But it also revealed a secret life that Thormund had never suspected, a deeper game that his younger brother had been playing while he thought they were simply building a prosperous future for their clan. "Why didn't you tell me?" Thormund whispered to the empty air, as if Ragnar's spirit might somehow answer. "Why did you face this danger alone?" But even as he asked the question, he knew the answer. Ragnar had kept his mission secret because he knew his older brother too well. He knew that Thormund would have insisted on coming along, would have tried to protect him from the political complexities that required delicate handling rather than warrior's strength. Ragnar had been trying to spare his clan and his brother from the violence that his death had ultimately unleashed. Around the settlement's main square, the surviving Raukr clan members emerged slowly from their hiding places. They moved with the cautious respect due to a force of nature, but also with something that might have been understanding. Grim's final words had been heard by many ears, and the truth of Ragnar's mission was spreading through whispered conversations. An elderly woman, bent with age but carrying herself with the dignity of high status, approached Thormund carefully. "You are the brother Ragnar spoke of," she said, her voice carrying the authority of a clan mother. "He came to our settlement in peace, seeking to preserve the bonds between our peoples. The men who killed him wore our weapons and spoke our names, but they were not our sons." "Then who were they?" Thormund asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Sellswards and outlaws, hired by those who grow rich when clans make war upon each other," she replied. "They took our gold and our weapons, then used both to murder a good man and blame us for his death. Your brother died trying to expose their treachery, and his death has given them the conflict they sought." Thormund looked around at the bodies scattered through the settlement's streets. 16 warriors who had died for crimes they had not committed, cut down by his hand in service of a lie. The weight of that realization threatened to crush him, but beneath the guilt and horror, a new kind of rage was building. Not the hot fury that had driven him to seek vengeance, but the cold anger of a man who had been used as a weapon in someone else's war. "The true killers," he said, his voice carrying a deadly quiet that made the clan mother step back. "Where are they?" "Gone," she replied. "They took payment for their work and disappeared like smoke on the wind. But the ones who paid them—" She hesitated, then continued with visible effort. "Your own clan, Thormund, son of Bjorn. The answers you seek lie in Ulfstad." The words hit him like a physical blow. Members of his own clan had arranged his brother's murder, had manipulated his grief and rage to start the very war that Ragnar had died trying to prevent. Someone he had trusted, someone who had watched him grieve and prepare for vengeance, had been playing a deeper game all along. Thormund carefully folded Ragnar's letter and tucked it inside his jerkin, next to the bone whistle and silver arm ring that had become his talismans of loss and memory. But now they carried a different weight, not just the pain of bereavement, but the burden of terrible knowledge and the promise of a very different kind of justice. "The debt is not settled," he said to the clan mother, though his words were meant as much for himself as for her. "But it belongs to different men than I thought." As he turned to leave the settlement, walking through streets littered with the bodies of innocent warriors who had died for others' lies, Thormund felt his transformation completing itself in a new direction. He was still the weapon of vengeance that grief had forged, but now his target had changed. The true enemy was not the Raukr clan, but the corruption that existed within his own people, the poison that had killed his brother and turned him into an instrument of their treachery. Behind him, the Raukr clan began the grim work of burying their dead and trying to understand how their world had been shattered by forces they had never seen coming. Ahead of him lay Ulfstad, the home he had left as a grieving brother seeking justice, and to which he would return as something far more dangerous, a man who knew the truth, and who possessed both the will and the ability to act upon it. The war faction had created their perfect weapon in Thormund's rage and grief. Now they would learn what happened when that weapon discovered who had truly forged it, and why. The journey back to Ulfstad took 3 days, but Thormund felt as if he were traveling through a different world than the one he had left. The painted warrior who had ridden north seeking simple vengeance was returning as something far more complex and dangerous, a man who carried the weight of terrible knowledge and the burden of betrayal by his own people. The first sign that his homecoming would be different from what he had expected came while he was still a day's ride from the settlement. Smoke rose from too many fires, and the sound of hammering echoed through the forest, the distinctive rhythm of weapons being forged in haste. As he drew closer, he could see armed patrols moving along the borders of Ulfstad territory, and the main paths had been blocked with fallen trees and sharpened stakes. His clan was preparing for war. Thormund approached the settlement openly, making no attempt to conceal his presence from the sentries who watched the forest paths. He wanted to be seen, wanted word of his return to spread quickly through the community. The reactions of certain people to his unexpected survival would tell him much about who could be trusted and who had played a role in his brother's murder. The first patrol to intercept him consisted of 6 young warriors, all of whom had trained under his guidance at some point in their lives. Their leader, Eric the Bold, greeted him with obvious relief, but also visible confusion. "Thormund," Eric called out as he dismounted his horse. "Thank the gods you're alive. We heard stories, impossible tales of slaughter and madness. Are you injured? How many did you—" "I need to speak with Harold Greybeard immediately," Thormund interrupted, his voice carrying a new quality that made the young warriors step back unconsciously. "And I need to know who has been spreading word of my actions in Raukr territory." Eric exchanged glances with his companions, clearly uncertain how to respond to this painted stranger who wore Thormund's face but radiated an entirely different presence. "Harold is in the Great Hall with the War Council. They're planning our response to the Raukr clan's inevitable retaliation. After what you did to their warriors, what I did was necessary," Thormund said quietly. "But perhaps not for the reasons everyone believes." As they rode toward the settlement's main gate, Thormund studied the defensive preparations his clan had undertaken in his absence. The work was professional and thorough, but it also showed signs of haste and confusion. Men were preparing for a war they did not fully understand, driven by fear and anger rather than clear strategic thinking. The Great Hall of Ulfstad was packed with warriors and clan elders when Thormund entered, still wearing his war paint and carrying the weapons that had spilled so much blood in recent days. Conversations died away as he strode through the crowd, leaving a wake of silence behind him like a ship cutting through still water. At the far end of the hall, Harold Greybeard sat at the high table with the clan's most senior members. But Thormund's attention was drawn immediately to a man who should not have been there, Sven the merchant, who had spoken so confidently about the Raukr clan's honor and their leader's trustworthiness just days before Ragnar's departure. The Great Hall of Ulfstad hung on the wall behind the high table, its ancient bronze surface gleaming in the firelight. The horn was one of the clan's most sacred relics, used only for the most momentous occasions, declaring war, calling for aid, or announcing the death of a clan leader. Its presence in the hall suggested that very serious decisions were being made. "Thormund," Harold said, rising from his chair with visible relief. "We feared the worst when scouts brought word of battles in Raukr territory. Are you injured? How many of their warriors did you—" "All of them," Thormund replied simply, his voice carrying clearly through the packed hall. "The men who raided Ragnar's trading party are dead. Every last one." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd, mixing awe and fear in equal measure. These people had known Thormund all his life, had watched him grow from boy to man, had trusted him to protect their settlement and their families. But the painted figure who stood before them now was something different, something that made their hearts race with instinctive unease. "All of them?" Sven the merchant asked, his voice carrying a note that might have been surprise or might have been something else entirely. "But the report said there were 24 warriors in the raiding party. 24 men died for my brother's murder," Thormund confirmed, his eyes never leaving Sven's face. "But before they died, they told me interesting things about who hired them and why." The silence in the hall became absolute, broken only by the crackling of the central fire and the distant sound of weapons being forged in the settlement's workshops. Thormund reached into his jerkin and withdrew Ragnar's hidden letter. Its parchment stained with blood but still readable. "My brother was not killed by random raiders," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "He was murdered by mercenaries, hired to prevent him from exposing a conspiracy, a plot to start a war between our clans by certain members of both communities who profit from conflict." Harold leaned forward, his weathered face creasing with confusion and concern. "What are you saying, Thormund? What conspiracy?" "I'm saying that someone in this hall arranged my brother's death," Thormund replied, his gaze sweeping across the assembled clan members. "Someone who knew about his secret mission to preserve the peace, someone who stood to gain from the war his murder would start." The accusations hit the gathering like a physical blow. Men began looking at their neighbors with suspicion, hands moving instinctively toward weapons, voices rising in angry denials and demands for proof. But Thormund's attention remained fixed on Sven the merchant, whose face had gone pale beneath his graying beard. "You spoke very confidently about Grim Ironarm's honor," Thormund said, stepping closer to the merchant's position near the high table. "You seem to know exactly how the Raukr clan would respond to trading negotiations, almost as if you had inside knowledge of their customs and leadership." I have traded with them for years," Sven stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Of course I know their ways. That's why the elders sent me to—" "To what?" Thormund interrupted. "To advise my brother on the best routes and contacts, to ensure his trading mission would be successful." The merchant's silence was answer enough. Around the hall, other clan members began to understand the implications of what they were hearing. Sven had indeed advised Ragnar on his final journey, had recommended specific routes and meeting places, had vouched for the safety of traveling through Raukr territory. "The gold," Thormund continued relentlessly, pulling a small leather pouch from his belt, payment he had taken from the bodies of the mercenaries at the fortress. "Enough to hire 24 sellswords for a single job. And these," he scattered several silver coins on the floor, their surfaces marked with the distinctive stamp of Ulfstad's mint. Harold picked up one of the coins, examining it closely. "This is from our treasury," he said slowly, "marked with the seal we use for official clan business." The evidence was overwhelming, but Sven made one final attempt to maintain his innocence. "Anyone could have stolen those coins. This proves nothing. You're letting grief and rage cloud your judgment. His protests died away as Thormund drew his long knife and placed its point against the merchant's throat. The blade was still stained with the blood of the men who had died in Raukr territory, and its edge gleamed with deadly promise. "The men I killed told me where to find the gold," Thormund said quietly. "They told me who paid them and why. They told me about the merchant who provided information about Ragnar's route and schedule. They told me about the man who stood to profit from a war between our clans." You can't prove anything," Sven whispered, but his voice carried the weight of defeat. "The word of dying men means nothing. You have no witnesses." "No, I have this," Thormund replied, pressing the letter against the merchant's chest with his free hand. "Written in my brother's own hand, detailing his suspicions about who was working to undermine the peace. Your name features prominently. Sven, along with your contacts in other clans, your network of mercenaries, your plans to profit from the chaos you were creating." The truth was spreading through the hall like wildfire now, carried by whispered conversations and exchanged glances. The clan members who had been preparing for war against the Raukr clan were beginning to understand that their real enemy had been living among them all along, eating at their table and advising their leaders while plotting their destruction. Harold rose from his chair, his hand moving to the ceremonial sword that marked his authority as clan leader. "Sven the merchant," he said formally, "you stand accused of treason, murder, and conspiracy against your own people. How do you answer these charges?" But Sven's answer came not in words, but in action. With desperate speed, he drew a hidden dagger and lunged toward the Great Horn of Ulfstad. If he could sound the ancient relic, it would call every warrior in the settlement to arms, creating chaos that might allow him to escape in the confusion. He never reached the horn. Thormund's knife took him in the back, piercing his heart with the same precision that had killed 24 men in Raukr territory. The merchant collapsed beside the high table, his blood spreading across the ancient stones, while the great horn remained silent above him. "The debt is settled," Thormund announced to the watching crowd. "My brother's murder has been avenged, and the conspiracy that killed him has been exposed. Let no one say that justice was not done." But even as he spoke the words, Thormund knew that the settling of one debt had created others. His actions in Raukr territory, though based on false information, had still resulted in the deaths of innocent warriors. The war that Sven had tried to start might still come to pass, unless someone could find a way to repair the damage that had been done. The Great Horn of Ulfstad gleamed in the firelight, waiting to sound the call that would determine whether the clans moved toward war or peace. The choice now lay with those who remained, and with the painted warrior who had become both the instrument of vengeance and perhaps the key to preventing the very conflict his brother had died trying to stop. The death of Sven the merchant changed everything. As his blood cooled on the stones of the Great Hall, the assembled clan members struggled to comprehend the full implications of what they had witnessed. The man they had trusted with their trade negotiations and diplomatic missions had been revealed as a traitor who had orchestrated the murder of one of their most beloved members. But the revelation brought new problems, as complex as those it had solved. Harold Greybeard called for the hall to be cleared of all but the clan's most senior members. As the crowd dispersed, murmuring among themselves about the shocking revelations, only the inner circle of elders remained, 12 men and women who had guided Ulfstad through good times and bad for more than a generation. At the center of their circle sat the Judgment Stone, an ancient piece of black granite carved with runes that predated written memory. The Judgment Stone had been used by the clan for momentous decisions since their ancestors first settled in these lands. Legend claimed it had been blessed by the gods themselves, and that any decision made while touching its surface would be guided by divine wisdom. Whether or not the legends were true, the stone carried the weight of tradition and the respect of every clan member. "We face a crisis unlike any in our clan's history," Harold began, his weathered hand resting on the Judgment Stone's carved surface. "Our brother Thormund has exposed a conspiracy that threatened our very survival. But his actions in pursuing justice have created new dangers. Thormund stood before the council still wearing his war paint, though much of it had faded during his journey home. The ancient markings gave him the appearance of something caught between the world of men and the realm of spirits. Fitting, perhaps, for someone who had crossed so many lines in pursuit of vengeance. 24 innocent Raukr warriors are dead, continued Magnus the law speaker, an elderly man whose knowledge of custom and precedent was legendary throughout the northern territories. Killed by one of our people in what they believed was justified revenge, but which we now know was based on false information provided by a traitor. The Raukr Clan will demand compensation, added Astrid Ironhair, the settlement's most respected war leader and one of the few women to hold such a position. They have lost nearly a full generation of their finest warriors. Gold alone will not satisfy them. They will want Thormund's life, said Olaf the Navigator bluntly, or they will want war. Those are the only options that preserve their honor after such losses. The council members looked at Thormund, waiting for his response to these grim assessments. He had stood silently through their deliberations, but now he stepped forward and placed his own hand on the judgment stone beside Harald's. The ancient granite felt warm beneath his palm, as if it contained some ember of the fires that had forged it. I will face whatever judgment the stone demands, Thormund said quietly. My brother's murder has been avenged, and the conspiracy against our people has been exposed. If my life is the price for peace between our clans, then it is a price I am willing to pay. Your death would satisfy Raukr honor, Magnus acknowledged, but it would also rob us of our greatest warrior at a time when we may need such strength. There are other conspirators. Sven spoke of networks and contacts in multiple clans. His death may have cut off the head of this snake, but the body may still be alive. Harald's fingers traced the ancient runes carved into the judgment stone's surface, following patterns that had guided his predecessors through countless difficult decisions. There is another way, he said slowly, a path that might serve both justice and wisdom. The clan leader looked up at Thormund, his eyes reflecting the weight of leadership and the burden of making choices that would affect generations yet unborn. You have become something beyond our normal understanding, Thormund, son of Bjorn. Neither fully man nor fully legend, but something that exists between the two. Perhaps that is exactly what this situation requires. What are you proposing? Astrid asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Trial by combat, Harald replied. Let Thormund face a champion chosen by the Raukr clan. If he wins, it proves that the gods favor his cause, and his actions were justified. If he loses, his death satisfies their demand for justice while preserving the honor of both clans. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from the central fire, carrying with it implications that would ripple through both communities for years to come. Trial by combat was an ancient tradition, older than Christianity and deeper than political alliances. It invoked the judgment of the gods themselves, and its outcome would be accepted by all parties as divinely ordained. The Raukr clan will choose their strongest champion, Olaf warned. Probably someone with a personal grievance against Thormund, perhaps a brother or son of one of the men he killed. That is their right, Thormund replied, and it is fitting. Let them choose the best warrior they have, and let the gods decide whether my quest for justice was righteous, or if I have become the very evil I sought to destroy. Harald pressed his palm firmly against the judgment stone and spoke the ancient words that made such decisions, binding upon the entire clan. It is decided. We will send envoys to the Raukr settlement with our proposal. Trial by combat to settle the debt of blood between our peoples. As the council dispersed to make the necessary arrangements, Thormund remained alone with the judgment stone. The ancient granite seemed to pulse with warmth beneath his touch, as if the spirits of his ancestors were trying to communicate across the gulf that separated the living from the dead. Tomorrow, messengers would ride north, carrying the proposal that might prevent a war or might simply formalize the beginning of one. Within days, he would face an enemy chosen specifically to kill him, selected from among the finest warriors of a clan that had every reason to want him dead. The Raukr clan's response came faster than anyone had expected. 3 days after the envoys departed Ulfstad, carrying Harald's proposal for trial by combat, a war party of 40 warriors appeared on the southern ridge overlooking the settlement. At their head rode a massive war banner that had not been seen in the northern territories for more than a generation. The blood eagle of the Raukr clan, unfurled only when the entire tribe gathered for war or the most sacred ceremonies. The sight of that ancient banner sent a chill through every person in Ulfstad who was old enough to understand its significance. The blood eagle was not just a symbol of military might, but a declaration that the Raukr clan considered this matter to be one of existential importance. They had not come simply to negotiate or to witness a trial by combat. They had come prepared to settle the matter with steel and fire if necessary. Thormund stood on the walls of his settlement, studying the approaching war party through the grey morning mist. Even at a distance, he could see that these were not the usual mix of veterans and young warriors that made up most clan expeditions. Every man in the formation moved with the confidence of a seasoned fighter, and their equipment gleamed with the quality that spoke of wealth and careful preparation. "They've brought their entire war council," observed Astrid Ironhair, who had joined Thormund on the wall to assess the approaching threat. "I count at least 6 clan leaders, maybe more. This isn't just about settling a blood debt. They're treating this as a formal challenge to their authority in the region." Harald Greybeard climbed the wooden steps to join them, his face grave with concern. "The Blood Eagle banner changes everything," he said quietly. "If they've invoked that symbol, then failure to resolve this matter satisfactorily could mean war with every clan allied to the Raukr tribe." As the war party drew closer, details became visible that made the situation even more ominous. The warriors rode in perfect formation, their weapons and armor marking them as elite fighters rather than ordinary clan members. More importantly, they carried the banners of at least 4 other clans, evidence that word of the massacre had spread throughout the region, and that other tribes were taking sides in the growing conflict. The Raukr formation stopped just outside bow range and sent forward a single rider carrying a white banner of truce. The messenger was a young warrior, probably chosen for his speed rather than his diplomatic skills, and he approached the settlement's main gate with visible nervousness. "I seek Harald Greybeard, leader of the Ulfstad clan," the messenger called out when he reached speaking distance. "I carry words from the war council of the Raukr tribe." Harald descended from the walls and met the messenger at the gate, accompanied by Magnus the law speaker and 2 other elders. The formal nature of the exchange was important. Every word and gesture would be remembered and repeated, becoming part of the story that would be told for generations about how this crisis was resolved. "Speak your message," Harald commanded, using the ancient formula that granted the messenger safe passage and protection under the laws of hospitality. The young warrior dismounted and pulled a scroll from his saddlebags, unrolling it with hands that trembled slightly from the weight of the responsibility he carried. "The War Council of the Raukr Clan has considered your proposal for trial by combat," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "We accept your terms with modifications." Harald's expression remained carefully neutral, but Thormund could see the tension in the clan leader's shoulders as he waited for the conditions that would determine whether this confrontation ended in honor or bloodshed. "The Raukr clan chooses as our champion Bjorn Ironside, son of the late Grim Iron Arm," the messenger continued. "He demands the right to face Thormund Firevein in single combat with weapons of his choosing, to avenge his father's death and the slaughter of our warriors." The name sent a murmur through the assembled Ulfstad warriors. Bjorn Ironside was legendary even among their enemies, a giant of a man who had earned his reputation in countless battles and raids. More importantly, he was the son of the clan leader that Thormund had killed, giving him both the skill and the personal motivation to be a deadly opponent. Furthermore, the messenger added, his voice growing stronger as he delivered the most crucial part of his message. The combat will be held at the Stone Circle of Judgment, witnessed by representatives from all the allied clans. The outcome will be binding upon all parties, and any attempt to interfere or seek revenge afterward will be considered an act of war against the entire Northern Confederation. Harold nodded slowly, understanding the implications of what he was hearing. The Raukr clan was not just accepting the trial by combat, they were turning it into a regional event that would establish precedents for how such conflicts would be handled in the future. Win or lose, this battle would reshape the political landscape of the Northern Territories. When? Harold asked simply. 7 days hence, at the rising of the sun, the messenger replied. Both champions will come to the circle armed, but accompanied by no more than 12 witnesses each. The gods will judge the righteousness of their causes. As the messenger remounted his horse and rode back to the waiting war party, Thormund felt a strange sense of completion settling over him. The path that had begun with his brother's murder was finally approaching its end, leading to a confrontation that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of 2 clans and the peace that Ragnar had died trying to preserve. The war banner of the Raukr clan snapped in the morning breeze, its blood-red eagle seeming to watch the settlement with predatory eyes. In 7 days, beneath that ancient symbol, the legend of Thormund Firevein would either reach its glorious conclusion or come to a violent end. The Stone Circle of Judgment stood on neutral ground between clan territories, its ancient monoliths raised by forgotten peoples in ages past. 9 towering stones formed a perfect circle on the windswept moor, each one carved with symbols that predated the arrival of the Norse tribes. This was a place where the gods themselves were said to watch mortal affairs, where justice carried the weight of divine sanction. 7 days had passed since the Raukr messenger delivered his clan's terms, and now representatives from 6 different tribes had gathered to witness the combat that would determine the fate of 2 peoples. The assembled crowd formed a respectful distance around the stone circle, their voices creating a low murmur that spoke of anticipation and unease. Thormund arrived with Harold and 11 other representatives of his clan, riding across the moor as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson. He'd spent the week in preparation, not just sharpening his weapons and conditioning his body, but making peace with the knowledge that he might not survive the coming battle. The man who had once forged tools for building and growing had become something that existed primarily to destroy, and perhaps it was fitting that his story should end in a place dedicated to the judgment of the gods. Bjorn Ironside was already waiting within the circle, and the sight of him confirmed every story that had spread throughout the Northern Territories. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and arms that looked capable of snapping tree trunks. Scars covered his visible skin like a map of battles fought and survived, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had built his reputation on the bones of his enemies. But it was not just his size that made him formidable. As Thormund studied his opponent, he could see the intelligence that had made Bjorn legendary, the way he moved with economical grace despite his bulk, the careful positioning that suggested he was already planning his attacks, the weapons he had chosen for their balance and reach rather than their appearance. "Thormund Firevein," Bjorn called out as his opponent entered the circle. "I have heard the songs they sing about you, the giant who killed 60 men in a day of reckoning. Today we learn whether legends bleed the same as ordinary mortals." Thormund said nothing as he took his position opposite the Raukr champion. Words belonged to the civilized world, and within this ancient circle only the most primal truths mattered. He drew his war axe and long knife, feeling their familiar weight in his hands, while the assembled crowds fell silent around them. An elderly priest of the old gods stepped forward to consecrate the combat. speaking words in a language older than memory while sprinkling blessed water on the stones. When the ritual was complete, he raised his staff toward the rising sun and called out the formula that would begin the trial. "Let the gods judge the righteousness of these causes," the priest declared. "Let steel and courage determine where justice lies." The battle that followed was unlike anything the watching crowds had ever witnessed. Two giants clashed in the center of the ancient circle, their weapons ringing against each other with sounds that echoed off the standing stones like thunder. Bjorn fought with the skill of a lifetime warrior, his swordwork polished by decades of combat, and his tactical mind sharp enough to anticipate many of Thormund's attacks. But Thormund had become something beyond ordinary human capability, shaped by grief and vengeance into a weapon that transcended normal limitations. He moved with fluid grace around Bjorn's powerful strikes, his own attacks finding gaps in defense that should not have existed. The wolf fang necklace at his throat caught the morning light as he flowed between offense and defense, and the war paint on his face gave him the appearance of something that belonged more to legend than reality. The combat raged for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. Two forces of nature testing their strength against each other, while the representatives of 6 clans watched in awed silence. Blood flowed from wounds on both warriors, staining the ancient stones with the kind of sacrifice that the old gods were said to favor. In the end, it was not superior skill or strength that determined the outcome, but choice. As Bjorn stumbled from a wound to his leg, creating an opening that would allow Thormund to deliver a killing blow, the painted giant hesitated. In that moment of decision, he saw not an enemy to be destroyed, but a son grieving for his father, a man not unlike himself, driven by love and loss to seek justice through violence. Instead of striking the fatal blow, Thormund stepped back and lowered his weapons. "Your father died honorably," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the circle. "He spoke truth with his final breath, revealing the conspiracy that murdered my brother. His death helped expose the real enemies of peace between our peoples." Bjorn stared at him in confusion, his own weapon still raised, but his attack faltering at this unexpected development. You spare me, why?" "Because killing you will not bring back your father or my brother," Thormund replied. "Because the real enemy was the corruption that turned us against each other, not the warriors who died believing they served justice." He walked to the center of the circle and placed his weapons on the ground, then reached into his jerkin to withdraw Ragnar's bone whistle and his father's silver arm ring. These artifacts, which had guided him through his transformation from peaceful craftsman to legendary warrior, now represented something different: the possibility of redemption and the choice to break cycles of vengeance that could destroy both clans. "I propose a different kind of justice," Thormund announced, his words directed not just to Bjorn, but to the assembled representatives of all the watching clans. "Let this circle become the foundation for a new saga stone, carved with the true story of what happened, how conspiracy and greed led to murder, how vengeance nearly started a war, and how 2 warriors chose peace over the satisfaction of personal grudges." The suggestion rippled through the watching crowds like wind through grain. A new saga stone would make this story permanent, a lesson carved in granite that would teach future generations about the dangers of letting hatred override wisdom. Bjorn slowly lowered his weapons, understanding dawning in his scarred features. "You would have us build a monument to peace? Here, where we came to settle matters with blood. Here, where the gods watch 2 fools learn that some victories are won by choosing not to fight," Thormund replied. As the sun climbed higher into the morning sky, the representatives of 6 clans began the discussions that would determine how this unprecedented resolution would be implemented. The new saga stone would tell the complete story: Ragnar's mission of peace, Sven's conspiracy, Thormund's quest for vengeance, and the final choice that prevented a war. Thormund Firevein had become a legend, but not in the way he had expected. He would be remembered not as the giant who killed 60 men, but as the warrior who chose mercy when vengeance was within his grasp, breaking the cycle of violence that had claimed his brother's life and threatened to destroy two clans. The bone whistle and silver arm ring were placed at the base of the central stone, artifacts that would be preserved as reminders of the love between brothers and the price of peace. And in the years that followed, when young warriors came to the stone circle of judgment seeking guidance, they would read the saga carved there and learn that the greatest victories sometimes came from knowing when not to fight.